social democratization, whether what Extinction Rebellion represented last year and what this remarkable wave of Black Lives Matter protests represents now is a shift back to protest, to the exclusion of the type of politicization directed at actually getting into the state to the end of transforming it. I think that's what's now in play. And I think other than that, I'd be interested in hearing your questions and your reactions to that.
I mean, that did come up last time. And yeah, we can open up the conversation, obviously, to use the stack, but that came up last time because, right, there have been people writing, obituaries for like the left populist moment. I think Anton Yeager wrote one not that long ago. And the thought that, kind of for many of us, I think when we had our Bigger Than Bernie discussion, someone mentioned that the horizon of Bernie running for president has kind of extended over now 5 years or so, and that is now over in the US. So what does this mean, a fundamental transformation? Or, do these Black Lives Matter protests lead to more Bernie-crats getting elected, lead to some kind of continual dialogue? Yeah, I was curious, like, do you have a quick answer? Or
Well, I don't think anybody has a crystal ball, but I think in terms of our strategic orientations, what one has to hope is that there will be a synergy, and that it's my view that what you guys have done is not unrelated to the tremendous diversity of these protests. I think that is an organic element in them. It's not something separate from them. And the crucial thing will now be to go forward in a strategic way that doesn't go back to the anarchist moment that really defined the anti-globalization movement all the way to Occupy. That is, that parties, looking at the failures and limitations of the communist parties and the social democratic parties, that parties did not fulfill their claim that they could be agencies of socialist transformation in the 20th century. So then there was this very strong orientation to changing the world without taking power. And that's not to say that those protests were unimportant. They were enormously important. And they reflected the very limited, in fact, hegemony of neoliberalism. They were proof that neoliberalism was nearly as hegemonic as some people claimed it was in the first decade of the 20th century, before the 2008 crisis. And Occupy helped redefine class politics, or bring it back on the agenda with that very crude class map of 99 to 1. But it was very much an anarchist moment, which was hostile to party building. And I also think was, on the whole, pretty hostile to party building to the end, not so much of immediately getting into the state, as working class reformation. The role that parties have always played in making the working class itself into an agent of change, of forming it, giving it organizational capacity. So one doesn't know where this is going to go, but one really hopes that where it will go is to take this remarkable moment of protest in directions that facilitate further party building and working class formation. Now, that's easily said in the abstract. How you do it concretely is a whole other question.
And you mentioned in the book, I guess, political education as being one key thing that parties, when they're working at their best, do, sort of mass political education. and obviously being a political education discussion, that was of particular interest to people. So I'm curious what organizing role does strategic or theoretical or kind of intellectual work have in sort of broadly trying to tie together class formation and party building?
Well, maybe the first thing to say about this is this very much relates to the importance of the 2020 election in the United States. It's not so much a matter of getting Biden elected. It's primarily a matter of preserving political space so this type of socialist education can continue. What makes a difference between even the United States today as a bourgeois democracy and a capitalist dictatorship is not only, and maybe not even so much, repeated elections and competitive political parties. It is freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, above all, freedom of assembly in the context we're witnessing today, and freedom of association, and Trump's response to this wave of protests, which was to identify not only Antifa, but left-wing organizations, far-left organizations, was, in my view, directly intended to refer to you guys. And that has very much to do with what space could be closed down for socialist political education, or even anything short of that, just the type of educational work, freedom of press work, freedom of speech work that's necessary for working class formation. So it seems to me what really matters now is to see 2020 in terms of a defensive electoral struggle. I think the response we've seen from elements of the military to Trump saying things like this is very important, because it would indicate that an attempt to close political space in this way would not be passively received in the ruling class. And if there's an attempt on his part to either postpone the election or get the Supreme Court, because it would have to go to the Supreme Court given the constitutional confusion that would entail, to get the Supreme Court to allow him to postpone the election, or to have the election and declare it invalid because of fraudulent voting, quote unquote. We can now hope to some extent that this would produce enough dissension in the crucial repressive apparatus of the state that he might not be able to pull that off. Because if that were to happen, I would imagine it would make the protests we've seen in the last week look like a Tea Party. And I don't mean the Boston Tea Party. I mean, I can imagine that you would see rioting on a scale that would frighten the liberals. The really crucial thing, I think, of seeing the election as important in the face of these protests is precisely to make sure that what we will talk about the importance of socialist education, continued organization, how to sink roots in the working class, how to use whatever electoral credibility that getting Sanders, our revolution type candidates elected at state levels and local levels, et cetera, to link with working class struggles broadly defined, that all of that still be possible after November 2020. I think that one really needs to take seriously the parallels with the early 1930s in Europe. which we need to remember were based on, for the most part, not in Spain, but certainly in Germany and elsewhere, authoritarian leaders getting elected and then closing down immediately freedom of association and assembly. First of all, the unions were shut down before the communist parties were in Germany. So the link with socialist education and electoral politics isn't so much now about getting Sanders elected, and I didn't think it ever was. It is about creating more political space, which you've already done, and you can do a lot more. You've already done discursively by making socialism a relevant word again, a believable word, I think a richer word in American political culture than it's probably been in a century. And I'd like to hear your responses to that. I think a lot of people on the revolutionary left, revolutionary in the sense of bourgeois democracy is a mere cover for a capitalism that is inherently authoritarian, no matter the political form. And that what the current protests represent is the possibility of an insurrectionary overthrow of the state, and that elections are diversions from that. And I think we'll be hearing a lot of that from certain elements of the far left. We already are. That seems to me that's something that needs to be countered with a lot of confidence, precisely in terms of understanding the conditions for having the possibilities of building real socialist organizational capacity.
I want to open up Stack to people in general. So feel free to get on. I see Lee first up. So Lee, go ahead.
Yes, I agree with what Leo was saying about the situation with Trump, and I was talking about that right before you got on. Trump, even if he loses, is not going away. Trump is going to start doing, if he loses, will develop a continuing rally situation where he builds a fascist movement. And, as I said before, the possible weakness of a Biden may create issues. But in terms of the idea of socialist space, I think right here in New York, we have a really good situation coming up next year with the citywide elections. In New York, all of the positions are coming up. The entire city council, the mayor, all of the elected positions will be up for grabs. And I was shocked to the extent that the mayor canceled himself in the last few days. I mean, why he took the positions he did and isolated himself so badly is amazing. And I think the number of liberal spokesmen who will speak for real estate money, which is what the issue is here in New York, is real estate money versus everybody. I think it's a really good situation to both do mass events as well as electoral events. And I think DSA is in a unique position to do it, but we have a lot of work to do to make it valid.
I'll go to Ryan, and Leo, feel free to jump in with direct responses, basically. Otherwise, I'll just keep the discussion going. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree, and would just build on that by like giving the context of where we are in North Brooklyn. Right now we have one DSA member in state Senate, Julia Salazar, who represents our district. And similarly, we're running a slate of candidates, largely for state legislature, although additionally someone running for Congress. But the potential for us to get, even if just one more member of DSA into Albany, and then therefore like creating the seeds of a socialist caucus, I think will get people feeling the sense of victory as possible, and making sure that we're like keeping politics there and not just protest. And I think we're doing a really good balancing act of trying to not do the like, remember in November, you know, you don't have to protest, it's just a matter of voting. We are seeing that we can play a key role in both, in helping to emphasize and amplify the rebellion, while similarly showing political proposals and solutions to this. And as Lee points out, I think this is leading right into then the city council elections. And I think our initial proposal was, you know, we won't even consider endorsing a candidate who doesn't support our call for defunding $1 billion from the NYPD's $6 billion annual budget. And we might have to revisit that. Like, is that enough? What is the time period of what we're talking about? I'm not saying one way or the other, but I think that these are the types of political conversations that we can be having in the current moment. And I think it'll be very important, additionally, for drawing a line in the sand between liberals and progressives and ourselves. But I just think this is very important for winning a little bit and carving out a little bit of space for our organization. And then lastly, just an anecdote, I will say that handing out pamphlets at the rally yesterday in Washington Square Park, we went in with like 10,000. I think we handed most of them out, and people were absolutely on board with defund the NYPD being one of the main concrete demands. So I think that there's serious potential for us to grow as an organization, but also just to put this out there into the mass consciousness.
It's really great to hear that. One of the questions I would have is, how much accountability does someone like Julia Salazar have to the activists who got her elected? I realize that there's no formal accountability, but that can be judged also in practice, not just in terms of constitutional procedures, you know, what an elected state congresswoman has to DSA if she's a DSA member, but in practice, what kind of accountability is there? And given the history of social democratic parties, it's very, very important that that be there from the beginning. And socialist education very much needs to be about that. And part of the role of socialist education, to go back to Jeremy's point, not only needs to be socialist education, if you like, downwards to the membership, to the activists, but socialist education upwards. One of the great failures of social democratic parties through the 20th century, and indeed into the 21st, even when these insurgencies have emerged, as with Corbyn or Syriza or Podemos, was a sense that the people who were getting elected didn't need to be educated in socialist terms. You know, the Blairites in the Labour Party put enormous resources into making sure that the Parliamentary Labour Party from 1997 on was inducted into neoliberal globalization of a humanitarian kind. They were lectured by Anthony Giddens and sent off to read Friedman, etc. I mean, Thomas Friedman, not Milton Friedman. And whereas I don't think that the left, including Momentum, played that kind of role with people in the Parliamentary Labour Party who weren't necessarily Blairites and who weren't even yet career politicians. And therefore, being engaged in making sure that they are relatively clear of themselves, about themselves ideologically and in terms of strategy, as in some sense socialists, without attempting, I think, to construct a kind of central committee control over them. We have to find a way to do that in a way that doesn't go back to Stalinism, or even, I would say, even to Leninism. It's what needs to be discovered in the 21st century, but this is very, very important as well. So I'd like to throw that back to you. You've had a success in getting Salazar elected. How do you make her accountable? And then this will apply if the DSA continues to grow inside or outside the Democratic Party, whether there's a dirty break or not. Momentum very quickly and very impressively was able to get all of the constituency delegates to the Labour Party National Executive Committee elected. So the whole of that portion of the National Executive Committee came from the Momentum slate. But they had no accountability to Momentum once they were there. There were no mechanisms. There was not even a political culture of accountability. That's inside the Labour Party, let alone the kind of separation that exists between someone who's in the assembly and activists like yourself outside of it. So I just would like to raise that and get people to think about it.
I definitely have some thoughts on that, but Robbie, why don't you go?
Sure. I don't have super deep thoughts on that in particular, although I'll say a couple things about the question of elected officials and accountability. I think right now, DS across the country, the way in which DSA candidates and elected officials are held accountable is mostly their reliance on volunteer activist hours by DSA members to power their campaign, which is good and is substantive and not procedural. However, if we have any more success, they won't rely on that anymore, right? So that's not a resource that I think we can expect to go on indefinitely. I would say like thinking just not particularly about Julia Salazar, but just generally about DSA candidates. I think something that we should expect of them is that they're active members of their local chapters, that they participate in the general, like, I think they should be expected to go to most general meetings, like at least a couple political education events. I think they should consider themselves to be members of their local chapter. I think that would go a long way. And again, trying to think of things that are like, I forget how you put it, Leo, but substantive and not sort of constitutional or procedural. Although I do think something that DSA does need to do procedurally, constitutionally, is DSA doesn't have a national platform. And I would like DSA to develop a national platform so that there can be some standard by which to at least formally discipline candidates to at least a minimum and relatively broad platform. So I would say that. And the other thing that one more thing, and this is more a question for Leo. I don't know if it, doesn't have to be right now, but I would be curious to hear. I know there are internal elections within Momentum happening right now, and there are different slates competing. I don't really, just some people I follow from the internet and from reading Tribune, trying to get a sense of what the stakes are in that election. And, I think one thing that I am proud of DSA in comparison to Momentum is that, there is a pretty vibrant democratic, culture in DSA, and that seems to be, and a culture of political education. It seems to be less the case in Momentum. I'm wondering if what you think the prospects are for that changing. Are there one slate that's running that's better on that? I haven't really been able to get a sense of the lay of the land, and I was wondering if you could inform us.
Okay, let me talk about that a bit. they are very different organizations. I mean, Momentum came out of Jeremy's successful campaign for the party leadership. It partly came into being in order to hold on to the list of people who had signed on to Jeremy's campaign for the leadership and not let the party bureaucracy have that list. It was partly a proprietary thing. And they were quite right to do this, because the first thing that happened, of course, after Corbyn was elected leader, was a coup was instantiated, and within a year, Momentum had to act again as a mobilizing force to get him reelected, and was even more successful. He was reelected with 61% of the vote. So there was a civil war going on of a much more intensive kind in the Labour Party. And Momentum was the mobilizing camp, largely independent, but nevertheless mobilizing campaign for Corbyn. And it was extremely good at its social media connections in the way it did that. It had a much more focused, in that way, set of purposes. But it also meant that the people who had that list in their hands had an orientation, I think, to retaining control of the organization. On the other hand, and there's always a dialectic here, Momentum was immediately joined by people who who are often wonderful cadre politically, but were looking to try to form a Leninist political organization of some kind. Whether that was through entrism and a breakaway, etc. And they wanted to turn Momentum into a arena for that, which is very problematic, and would have led, I think, to the destruction of the organization. It was already leading to it in some ways. So that led to a further dynamic whereby when a constitution was established for Momentum, it wasn't a very democratic one. And that now is all in play. Two groups have formed, one being closer to the kind of insurrectionary mentality, the other being closer to the original people who formed it. But I think either of them are very coherent. And I wouldn't put your money on either of them. I think the crucial thing is that there are good people who really want to turn Momentum on both sides, on all sides, who now, in the wake of a very conventional career politician having taken back the Labour Party, and the party bureaucracy still not having been turned into a organizational socialist cadre, far from it, who want to turn Momentum into the type of organization that you guys want the DSA to be, engaged in class formation at a local level, engaged in socialist education, etc. And I think there's a very good chance it could do that. The danger is that there will be a decline in enthusiasm for Momentum. There's already been a fall off in membership. Back when Tony Benn was defeated in the early 1980s, when that early insurrection that first inspired Corbyn as a young man was defeated, the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy lost half of its membership after the 1983 election. And 2 years later was down to a third of its membership. So if we're going to take lessons here, we really have got to learn that the importance is that you find a way of continuing to be dynamically able to keep your members excited about what you're doing. And that never should have depended on Sanders alone. As many of you often told me, the chances of him getting the nomination were always less than the chances of him winning the presidency if he got the nomination. So it was never about Sanders, really. It was, sure, what Bernie had triggered, but it always had to be, and it was much more than that. I mean, obviously, just the example of what you've been doing in North Brooklyn indicates that. So it's really important that momentum be able to, turn itself from being a very effective social media campaign mobilizer for Corbyn and a really effective base for getting socialists into the national executive of the party. And the Labour Party really is a party in the way the Democratic Party is not. It really has a party organization. Some of that deadens it, of course. Most new Momentum members never went to a constituent Labour Party meeting. They joined at the national level. They never went to a constituent party meeting. And those who did go, for the most part, not always, were immediately put off by them because they were so boringly rule-bound and so electorally oriented, et cetera, et cetera. That wasn't the case everywhere. In some places, they really enlivened the local Labour Party in Hackney and Bristol, but very rarely in the working class constituencies that Labour then, first gained in 2017 under Corbyn, but then lost in 2019 when the populism was picked up by the right in most cases. So I don't know whether that gets to the kinds of questions Robbie was raising, but I hope it helps.
Arshia, you're next, and then Stack's open.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So there was really great discussions here, and I just wanted to say about the accountability. That's something that we've been asked by constituents when we do phone bank a lot, because they're sometimes they're asked. Like I used to canvass for Boris Santos, who was running for state, and a lot of the people that I came across, like, so like all these electoral people come and ask for votes. We don't really see a change in our community. And how would you guarantee any change with all these people that come to power? And my response was always, my personal response was like, no, we definitely would be, would take accountability into the option, of course. Like we would definitely, if they don't listen to everything we've been said and they've been promised, and we would firsthand put pressure on them. And that's because we've been really working hard. We're doing all this stuff for free as volunteers, so it's really important for them to follow. It's like simple answers like that. And I think that's something, maybe it's like a broader discussion to have. And another issue that I think Leo talked about was really important, the political education and the socialist education. The number one way we can have public to do that type of education is media. And we really need to like battle this like huge media of like anti-socialist rhetoric, even like different languages. I find it to be. And like, for example, I wanted to find out, I YouTube something for like socialism in Sweden, something like that. And just like every single video is about how Sweden is not socialist, and it's all like exclusively by all the right wingers. And it's just like, it's so much things against socialism that is it makes it a challenge for us to like make this some type of a broader education for. And we do have podcasts, we have YouTube channels, we have our type of, but I think it has to be more broader effort for media, like so like we have consumptions and we have consumers that use the DSA and socialist material, and that's something that we still work on, and I think it's a quite a challenge, and maybe I think Jeremy and other people can even talk about that more because they've been doing the political education for quite a while now.
If I could say something about that, I think that given the nature of the mainstream media, which defines politics in terms of getting people elected and then 2 years later getting them reelected. One of the most important things people you get elected need to become, is socialist educators. They need to use the legitimacy they get from being elected, not primarily to pass legislation, although that's important, but they need to use the attention they get in the media to foster socialist discourse, especially at a local level. So in relation to what's now going on, one of the most important things that DSA members who have been elected can be doing would be to come down to the level of the protests and be speaking at them and to the mainstream media in them in ways that open questions like, what would socialist policing amount to? And not be afraid to use that term. And you know, one of the things about political education that we should be doing is asking ourselves that question. It's very nice to be able to say, of course, there'd be no police in a socialist society. Well, apart from the fact that we're not going to get there for a hell of a long time. What is socialist policing as a process to getting there? And that isn't just about defunding, obviously, it's about changing the role of police forces. Tony Benn, when he first got his nomination in 1951, asked what he would do as an MP. And he said, my first priority would be to make, educate, and keep socialists. That didn't happen with the social democratic parties in Europe. And the sense in which Sweden is not socialist has a great deal to do with this. Most of the big social democratic parties made the communist parties of Europe look sometimes very democratic. The Swedish Social Democratic Party has conferences every 3 years. I would send students to go do PhD theses on Sweden because everybody wants to look at Sweden. How do we, get that kind of egalitarian society? And urge them to look at the internal processes of the party. And they'd constantly be shunted off to do some study of policy, right? Never of what is the democratic process inside it. And those are very top-down organizations. And Swedes are justly proud of the infrastructure that the labor movement built, which has not, even though the Social Democrats were the ones who deregulated finance first in Europe. And the first financial crisis occurred in Sweden in 1991-92. But a lot of the infrastructure of the post-war Swedish welfare state remains. But there's very, very little of a dynamic socialist culture around the Swedish Workers' Party. And that's true all the more of the German. So, it's easy to talk of Norway as the example. If you look at, or Canada as the example, if you look at Medicare, universal public health care. But there's not much to look at if Norway or Canada is your example in terms of what you're trying to do now, which is build dynamic socialist organizations at the base. In that sense, what you're doing is blowing past anything that now exists in Canada or in Sweden, for that matter. Yeah, I think that's all I'd want to say about that. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I just to briefly follow up on that, Leo. I mean, I guess I was mentioning this earlier. You know, you talk about the one I thought helpful distinction in your book is about class focused versus class rooted organizations, and that for the most part, the democratic socialist wave has been more class focused than class rooted. And I think, you know, aspirationally, I think DSA would like to transition more to the latter. But I am curious if you have some concrete suggestions for us, because I do think there are barriers. You know, the United States being a very segregated society, DSA, like Momentum, I think, is largely made up of people with college degrees, which is, you know, in the United States, a minority and a relatively better off part of the population, disconnected from some of the vital industries that make the economy go. So I guess, yeah, what your thoughts on how to use this period to put down class roots, for socialists to put down class roots?
Yeah, this is the $64 question. The fact that most of you are university educated doesn't seem to me very significant. On the contrary, in some ways, I think it's an advantage. If Trotsky and Lenin and Bukharin could have gotten jobs like I did as university professors, the Russian Revolution never would have happened. And one of the good things about what we now see as the failure of the Trotskyist parties who went off to create a better Leninism in the 1970s is that they did create a lot of very capable cadre who were very good at organizing the big anti-war demonstrations internationally in 2003, and in some cases, good cadre in being able to organize rank and file workers. They were, I think, trapped within a Leninist framework that didn't allow them to build that into a mass socialist organization. If they would recruit a worker, they'd immediately have him go back and read some pamphlet by Lenin, as if that was the way forward. In a language, in a Bolshevik language that is arcane in the 21st century, obviously. It's not a disadvantage that many people who are in this process of party building are intellectuals, broadly defined. And given the nature of what is happening to working classes and middle classes, I have a piece coming out in Catalyst on this in the next issue. The crucial thing is that people who would normally be located in the middle class as intellectuals, and that even goes as far as teachers, are increasingly, because teachers in capitalist societies have been very, very status conscious as a social group. And they often were, in fact, the basis of the socialization of working class people into a nationalist ideology of a xenophobic kind, right? Teachers were the base of some of the fascist movements in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. They were known as the Beamta. So there's a process of, if you like, proletarianization going on amongst various occupations, which were properly called middle class historically. not because they paid more, but because teachers had more autonomy in the labor process, because they controlled the work of other people, because they often set the agenda for what the substance of their work was. And to see what is happening with the teachers' strikes, the teachers' mobilizations in the United States is indicative of both a structural change, but also a very impressive voluntarist movement amongst teachers that is, I think, changing them so that one can begin to define them as part of a broader working class. And I think in that sense, there's every reason to think that the type of young people that have joined the DSA and Momentum and have attempted to move from protest to politics should be able to engage in the type of class formation we need, which is to take a working class which has been utterly transformed through the changes that have taken place in capitalism over the last 50 years, largely balkanized. And insofar as it has any class rootedness, it unfortunately has it because it's trapped in trade union organizations, which are not at all interested in developing the political capacities of their members. Indeed, are afraid of doing so because it might lead to cushy union staffer jobs being challenged. So, you know, I don't think that's the worry, and I think it does, if that notion of Andrew Murray's, who was, you know, a communist journalist who became leader of the Stop the War Coalition in Britain, which was the largest of the Stop the War coalitions anywhere after the Iraq War. He was the one who said that, and he partly says it as someone who has a communist rooting, and I think is rightly aware of the limitations of middle-class people who don't have their roots in the working class, and they end up being career politicians, unaccountable to working class people. I think that's right. But when he says that, he doesn't have any recipe for making the union that he's now chief of staff of. He's now chief of staff to Len McCluskey, who's head of Unite, which is Britain's largest union. That is not a very democratic union, although it's led by the left, to put it mildly. And he has said to me privately, we need a momentum in Unite. And they badly do, but there isn't one. And there'd be a lot of resistance from the left leadership, even were there to be one. So one of the ways in which, you know, you can, I think, root yourselves in the class is not only by following Marcia Niemeyer and trying to create labor branches of DSA. That's important. But also by getting active in the teachers' union to make the national and state level teachers' unions what they have not been. I mean, all the impressive stuff that Eric Blank wrote about is taking place at a local level. The teachers' unions nationally have not been transformed so that they themselves are agencies of the type of mobilization and education that has happened with the Chicago teachers, let us say. And, you know, as Megan Day says, insofar as the East Bay electoral activity gave them some legitimacy vis-a-vis the Oakland teachers and for the Oakland teachers strike, that now needs to be continued in a way that transforms the organization of teachers all the way up. So it isn't only for that strike. This becomes a permanent type of orientation to changing those organizations. This should be done in the nurses' unions as well. There's an enormous opportunity there, given the orientation of the leadership of the nurses' unions. But at the same time, nurses are very craft-minded. They are like the old craft unions. And it would be very, very important to get active in the nurses' unions to make them much more broadly representative of healthcare workers more generally, of hospital workers more generally. You know, you read Jane McAlevy's first book on this, organizing the Nevada hospitals. And that was about organizing them into one organization. So ICU nurses were in the same organization as the women doing the cooking in the basement, and finding common grounds for struggle, not least around an issue like staffing. Because women, the top issue for them is, you know, when do we have to be in work in order to make sure that our kids are taken care of, to have some planning. And that was the type of link in the labor process then led to a broader sense of identity amongst those types of workers. Coming out of this COVID crisis, this is really going to become important. I think there is an enormous sense of solidarity among healthcare workers at the moment. How to build that solidarity into an organizational identity and coherence and class consciousness, it will really become important. So, you know, those are the types of occupations that are more proximate to your own, I guess. But I don't think that it, you know, really is a barrier to playing the same kind of role in the Amazon warehouses, you know, which are ripe for organizing. And this is what's going to need to be done, and it's going to have to be done in a way where those of you who are quote unquote intellectuals have no sense, and you shouldn't have, that Amazon workers aren't as capable of being intellectuals as you are. That's what the socialist education is all about. And the type of educational stuff that is done in DSA and hopefully Momentum should be precisely of the kind that that doesn't have a class division built into it, if and when they become members of the DSA. You know, where they are being taught by you rather than you learning from them.
Carrington.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'd like to re-up Robbie's point he brought on, or he brought up just before Leo got on, about internationalism. I think he was referencing in the book something the authors say that Syriza's defeat can largely be attributed to German labor and their lack of solidarity. I'm involved in DSA's international committee, where we've been sort of restructuring over the past couple of years in order to be able to accommodate membership and sort of strategize, like working on strategies to be effective. But we're sort of on the verge of launching with a bunch of subcommittees that some are thematic, some are regional, and you know, we do have ideas about going forward, but I wondered if you have any suggestions for how DSA in particular can help build international solidarity. And I'd just like to add that we get contacted by so many people from all across the globe that really, really want to connect with us. And I'm just not even sure how to be effective. Like when someone from the Italian Communist Party just wants to, you know, connect all the time, you know, how we can really how that can be useful. And if you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
You guys are in a really fortunate position. You're doing it in the empire. And you know, for a Canadian, and you know, the American left always looks to Canada as kind of your Sweden. You know, I've always been aware that we only look tall because you guys are on your knees. And we are far, far more dependent on what you will achieve as socialists than you are dependent on what we will achieve as socialists. The general answer to the question is that an abstract internationalism, because capital is international, doesn't take you very far. The fact is, whether we like it or not, that the way in which the world has been constructed into nation states, and the way in which the citizens of those states, working people in those states, even when they are class conscious of workers, think of themselves as American workers, as German workers, as Canadian workers, etc., reflects the fact that working people were absorbed into the nation state as citizens at the same time that the first mass organizations of the class were created between, well, the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. And you know, there was a contradiction in that. Workers were brought into the state as individual citizens, defined as members of a bourgeois nation state. Even at the same time, they were being organized into mass union socialist parties, et cetera, et cetera. So the world, for all of the fact that capital is more transnational than it's ever been, in terms of its political construction and the identity of working class people around the world, the struggles primarily still take place in the nation state. Nation states remain the center of gravity for political struggle in the modern world. That said, look at the asymmetry of nation states in the modern world. So the ability of Canadian socialists, even if we were successful, or Greek ones, to be able to do very much without cooperation and coordination with the larger and more powerful state forces around the world is limited. And what happened to Syriza was exactly what you've been saying, that unless the Northern European working classes were able to shift the balance of forces, not only in Germany, but also in Sweden, because in some ways it was the Nordic countries, the more social democratic ones, which were more concerned about fiscal rectitude than anybody else, and austerity than anybody else. And there was a lot of racism involved in this, whereby Northern European workers looked upon Southern European workers as lazy, even though they worked more hours than Northern European workers. So the inability to shift the balance of forces in the Northern European countries was, I think, in the end, the fundamental factor. There were many internal factors that reflected Syriza's own limitations, the limitations of the protest movements, which, once Syriza was elected, just left them there, rather than played a very creative role in terms of suggesting what Syriza could have done in concrete ways. But yeah, I think it is very much the case that, especially in smaller countries, we can only go so far unless there is change in the larger, much more important capitalist countries. So the reason you're hearing from Italian communists is that they are so weak now. The Italian Democratic Party, which used to be the Communist Party, is well to the right now of the American Democratic Party in policy terms. And it doesn't have any more mobilizing capacity than the American Democratic Party either. So, they are looking to you guys to inspire what might go on in Italy. I think a measure of you not getting very far, and this worried me somewhat about the Corbyn-led leadership, and even some of the great, really impressive momentum activists, a measure of you getting diverted will be if you spend too much of your time and resources on helping the Italian comrades, on having international meetings with them. Of course, and not to say that isn't important, and there isn't a lot to learn from one another. We do need to inspire each other. But if it becomes the equivalent of, kind of the second internationals meetings amongst career politicians leading up to World War I, rather than doing the hard work on the ground. I think that's a sign that the resources are being put in the wrong place. That's all I'd say about that.
Could I just have one
Yeah.
follow-up? I was sort of just saying that in justice, so many people are around the world are interested in the
And they should be.
DSA, and they just want to connect with us, and we want to be helpful, and but don't overvalue that type of thing. Although, see, it's, you know, it does have value, and we do have really good thinkers on our committee, and good, you know, good plans. But I just wondered, in terms of what you were talking about, like in terms of maybe capital controls, you know, if there's something that we could do with international solidarity toward that end, or toward some of those really sort of trickier topics you had discussed in the book.
That's really, that's the crucial question. It goes back to the first discussion about socialist education. I mean, look, you are so far from being the government of the United States, so far from it, which is not a bad thing in my view. I think it's very important that socialists today have the patience to build a type of mass socialist organization with a class base, that when they get into the state, they'd actually be able to do something. But you're right, once you're there, then in what way would a system of capital controls be viable? Again, the asymmetry of nation states in the world leads to American leftists having to worry about this less than Canadian ones. Precisely because we'd be so dependent on your cooperation, we had capital controls in Canada, in not letting capital flow to Wall Street. So we would need the type of international coordination that in fact was talked about in the run-up to Bretton Woods. And the proposals were coming out of the American Treasury at that time, from Harry Dexter White, who ended up being then a victim of McCarthyism. But what he was proposing was more radical than Keynes, which is a cooperative system of capital controls. So that if you are part of the Bretton Woods system, you are responsible for policing the capital that attempts to flow into one of the other countries within the system, right? That's the type of understanding of international capital control that we will need in the long run. Even more vexing in the short run is the migration crisis. The 21st century will continue to be one in which there will be tremendous push and pull pressures for transnational migration. Pull pressures of the kind, you know, who will be cleaning elderly people's feet even after this coronavirus is over in the nursing homes. That's the pull factor. The push factor is obviously the enormous inequalities between the advanced capitalists and the developing countries, and to some extent the degree of political freedom in them, and then of course the political conflicts that are taking place in so many parts of the world. So in that context, we are going to be faced with a working class that is open to nativist, especially in the United States, nativist responses to that migration crisis. And in that sense, we need to be internationalists as well, yet without being naive, because the open borders stuff is purely rhetorical. Purely rhetorical. It's impossible to conceive of any government in the contemporary world that can have open borders. And yet you want to have a migration policy that is as open as possible. So trying to develop, and none of us have developed this, a understanding of that contradiction, being able to speak to it in a popular way, and one that does eventually have a real policy focus, one that removes the policing role that ICE plays, that ICE plays, in the brutal role it plays, in the way it plays it, becomes very, very important. But it also, you're right, this is a dimension of the international that will have much more short-term consequences for the moment than the proposals on capital controls will. And I'd like to hear your response to what I had to say about this, because it really is, just, I think it's crudely formulated on my part. I mean, I really would like to hear, what you folks think about this.
Jeremy, how are we doing on time?
We're going a little over, but I figured we'd go till 1:15, so we have 5 more minutes.
Okay, I think that this is an interesting ongoing conversation. Some of our most effective international work we're doing right now is anti-war. We're trying to address sanctions. We're anti-sanctions, and that's where we have our best strength right now. And then, it's a question of where we want to focus our energies. But I think political education, and one of our subcommittees is economics and trade, and I think that we could have a really focused education there, bringing people, like you just described, that something that you would be able to speak about global economics in a popular way, but leading to real policy possibilities. And I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say to our economics and trade people, because I don't feel enough informed on the subject, except that it is important, like global economics is so important. And in terms of migration, that's a little trickier because it's such an inside-outside scenario where we have a immigration group, a national immigration group within DSA, and then the international subcommittee on immigration offers support to that. So I feel like I wish you'd write an article. I wish there'd be some sort of continued conversation around it. And Jeremy, maybe you have something to say to it.
I mean, I had a thought on some different stuff. I mean, I think the capital control stuff is interesting. I thought, in the book, you seem to argue that one thing that the Warren and Sanders type approaches shared in common was the idea that you could force a segment of capital to some degree reinvest in a green manufacturing economy in core capitalist countries to kind of rebuild them away from the neoliberal period. And you seem somewhat skeptical about that. I guess I was wondering, though, maybe that the sort of the common thread of that and the hope for that was to some degree a recognition that capital controls right now are so far outside of the land of political possibility that the question of how far we could get without them is something kind of we need to think very hard about. Although I would be thrilled if we could get them back.
Well, I think the really crucial thing at the moment is political education around this, when we very well in practical terms want to give priority to the importance, not so much of breaking up the banks, but of having one or two nationally owned banks, publicly owned banks, which would try to instantiate the issue of democratic control over what is invested, where it's invested, how it's invested, etc. And try to develop through, or at least put forward the notion of trying to develop the knowledge and capacity through the operation of those banks, through the people who would be working in them at every level, so that one eventually could imagine turning the whole banking system into a public utility. At the moment, except for Doug Henwood and maybe Bob Pollin, we don't have people who even feel comfortable talking about what banks do, let alone imagining how you could run them as a public utility. That said, I think the notion of breaking them up is not a socialist way forward, because it would simply lead to capital concentration again eventually in that sphere. And in any case, the smaller ones would be dependent on the ones that do more crucial type of investing. So it is still at this case, at this point, a matter of socialist education, I think. But some of it can be more oriented to what you would want out of a radical government. And insofar as it's not inconceivable today to imagine a Roosevelt type of government, it's not inconceivable. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's not inconceivable. And it's not inconceivable that a Green New Deal of a radical kind could come on the agenda, given the balance of forces, et cetera. Then you want to have short and long-term perspectives on this. But even when you put forward the short-term ones, yeah, let's have a national investment bank. You want to be putting that forward in socialist terms as a step towards the socialization of the whole of the banking industry. And I think that applies in general terms to almost any important industry you can point to, without wanting to do away with, the independent local bookstore or coffee shop, etc. So, that's how I would look at this discussion, if that's helpful.
One other thought I had on accountability, and then we might, I'll last chance for anyone on Stack, and then we can go our separate ways. But one thing I wanted to add on Robbie's point earlier about holding politicians, to some degree, what DSA has now is we have an activist base that is, sometimes referred to as an army of canvassers that makes the election of these people possible. And so to some degree, that acts as a potential disciplinary mechanism when we can say, well, if you stop being a socialist, we'll withdraw this. The other thing that I think is maybe interesting is in an American context, which I think is different than most other countries, is because of the way money in elections works here. Basically, these outsider candidates who renounce corporate donations as part of their kind of political identity, they need ways to get the massive funds required to run in races in a system where there's no or very little public financing of elections. And so DSA's capacity, which is still like developing, which is still very early, but our capacity to raise money and also use the withdrawal of money as a potential disciplinary tool on candidates, I think is another way that an American semi-party formation has to hold leverage over candidates who potentially want to stray. Basically, it makes a sort of an existential choice. Like, well, either you go through us and we help you raise funds, or you go to the corporations and then, you're gone from us entirely. Now, it's complicated because obviously someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on the one hand, has been better than maybe any of us could have imagined, but has the ability to raise almost infinite amounts of money through her media presence, does not rely on us either for that or her canvassing at this point. So.
That's a really great and interesting point, I have to say. And insofar as you can wield that type of control over DSA people who do get elected, whether for dog catcher or New York Assembly person or whatever, you should. And it's very important that you do it at this stage, because what happens with the social democratization of socialist movements is that people who don't intend to be career politicians, unaccountable to the people who got them elected, become career politicians. They don't want to go back to not only the factory floor, but being, part-time graduate researchers or teachers at the New School or whatever. And more than that, they sit in the assembly and they see that even a right-wing Democrat or a Republican on the other side of the House is not a, bastard who eats babies for breakfast, is a normal human being that, can be nice to them and jovial and somebody, good to have a drink with and learn from certain, how to operate in the assembly. And they immediately then lose a sense of class struggle. So having that kind of disciplinary awareness that people like this need to be accountable and need to see themselves primarily that way. And if they don't, being prepared to not renominate them again. Because we know, in the American case, no less than the British, it's, the elections every 2 years are about, insofar as they involve change, involve electing the few people who aren't incumbents. The incumbents are normally reelected. So it's really important that this be there at the beginning, that these people are accountable to the activists, to the socialists who put them there. It's really, really, and that's one of the reasons educating them is so important. Making them think of themselves as socialists. I mean, I'm very honored that you guys are reading my book. It's really important that the people you elect read the book. I know they're busy, but they come back and prove to you that they've read the book.
I like that. I think that might be a good place to end, unless there are any last comments. Okay, well, thank you, Leo, so much for joining us. Thank you to everybody who made it to the session. Took a little recording of this, so hopefully we'll get to distribute that to more comrades in this very interesting time to be thinking about these ideas. Important time, urgent time.
I really appreciate being invited, and I hope you can stay in touch.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
long.
everybody.
Thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Leo.
Thanks, Jeremy.
See ya.
Solidarity,
Bye.
all.
Thanks. Bye.
Solidarity, yo.
Bye.